Thanks, everybody. So we're going to start our next panel discussion, which is on access to new medications and preventables. So I want to invite, I see Anna Hyde here, Emily Wheeler, and MaryannWebb. If you guys want to come up and take seats, I'll do a brief introduction, then I'm going to hand it off to everybody to do about 10 minutes for their presentations. And hopefully that'll leave enough time for us to do some quick Q&A. I think we're what separates everybody from lunch. All right. No? Okay. We're not going to have lunch today, Christian says. So my name is Kevin Brennan. I'm with a lobbying and consulting firm called Bluebird Strategies, and I've had the opportunity to work with Christian and the Peggy Lillis Foundation for several years now, several months as a consultant. I'm really excited to have an opportunity to be here today to talk about the challenges we face as we try to find, new treatments and preventables, and even make sure we have access to current treatments, which can be difficult. And in my own personal journey, I've had psoriatic arthritis since I was 13 years old. At the time, my doctor would give me a handful of ibuprofen or Motrin and say, good luck with that. We're going to try to manage the pain as best we can. Thankfully, there was a revolution in the treatment of inflammatory arthritis. So we had new products coming out like Enbrel and Remicade and others that were life-changing for me personally. So I went from, thinking about a life in a wheelchair or being severely limited to what I can do to having access to, these new biologics so that, I could skydive. I've climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Back before COVID, I would bike 100 miles a week back and forth to work from my house. But without those things, my life would be far different. So making sure that people have access to those new treatments and that innovation is vitally important. And I know that as we work towards advocating for more research, bringing, and accelerating drugs to market, it's vitally important. I know that, it's important in a partnership between the private sector and patient groups to make that happen. Back when I worked on the Hill, I had a boss at one point who was a little more critical of the industry. I had come from Amgen to work for her. And I said to her, I'm glad somebody thought that they could make a profit off of my psoriatic arthritis. And for some of my Democratic colleagues, that was a horrifying thought. And I said, unless the NIH is bringing drugs through clinical trials and bringing them to the market and taking all that risk, the way we kind of do that process now requires that we provide, acceptable and appropriate rewards. So, there's got to be balance. I recognize that, but I think it's really important that patients have a strong voice in this process. So I'm excited today to have some really great panelists who are going to talk a little bit from different perspectives. As we look at this, we're going to have an industry perspective. We're going to have a non-for-profit perspective in the arthritis community around what they've been doing. And then ultimately, we're going to have a patient perspective to talk about. So I'm going to introduce this in order that we're going to have folks speak. And if you're more comfortable doing it from the table, or if you want to step up, your call as far as how you want to do that. So let me introduce Emily Wheeler first. She is the Director of Infectious Disease Policy at BIO. She's also has several other hats that she wears as Director of the Working to Fight AMR Public Awareness Campaign. She also serves on PACCARB, which is the Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic Resistance Bacteria. She serves on the Stakeholder Group for Global AMR R&D Hub, as well as the AMR Industry Alliance. She's doing a lot in that space, and we're really, really excited that she's here. Next, she'll be followed by Anna Hyde. Anna serves as the Vice President for Advocacy and Access. So she oversees a very large portfolio for the Arthritis Foundation, where she looks at state and federal, as also grassroots advocacy. The foundation's really, truly been a leader in looking at state and federal access. As I mentioned, a lot of these new products that have come to market are ones where they're a little bit sticky. So we've got to fight through some laws on the state or some requirements in the insurance space that say prior authorization or failing a therapy before you're eligible to try that. So, but they're looking at innovation, coverage and access, very big investment in public health, research, and dear to my heart, they're also very focused on juvenile arthritis and making sure that kids with arthritis not only have access to meds, but access to the specialized care that you need to get diagnosed and treated, because that's really critical. And then lastly, I'd like to introduce MaryannWebb. She is a C. diff survivor. After her journey of 3 years through a fecal transplant, she was able to, get relief for that. Her daughter, Lauren, who I believe is here somewhere, who is fantastic, and also works with Aaron Burns, who is also fantastic, make up some of the backbone of the Peggy Lillis Foundation, and I've been just thrilled to get to work with both of them because they're just quality people. Maryann's also had 25 years of an executive management roles, and she's been involved in regulatory affairs, directly engaged with FDA, as well as very important international regulatory bodies. And she's done that through work in dietary supplements, infant and clinical nutrition, and also through functional foods. So I'm going to step aside, and I'm going to ask Emily to either take a mic or take the podium, and she'll be presenting next.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you all today. As folks noted, my name is Emily Wheeler, and I am a Director of Infectious Disease Policy at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. BIO is a trade association that represents over 1,000 biotech companies in the United States and in 30 countries around the world. And combating antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, it has been a longstanding priority for BIO, working with other partners, including the Peggy Lillis Foundation and others, to ensure that innovative treatment options of anti-infectives are available for patients. Specifically related to the antibiotic sector, BIO represents over 50 companies that are working on innovative treatments, antifungals, antibiotics, non-traditional therapies, all sorts of different products that ultimately hope to bring new treatments to bear. As folks in this room are likely aware, antimicrobial resistance is one of the leading public health challenges of our time. And there is widespread understanding that there are a number of things that are really needed to help combat the threat of AMR. First of that is appropriate antimicrobial stewardship. So ensuring that antibiotics are used appropriately, that the right drug is being used for the right bug at the right time for the right duration. And appropriate antimicrobial stewardship really underscores all of the work to address this global public health threat, and links directly to ensuring that we have innovative treatment options. Due to widespread inappropriate antibiotic use, infections are becoming more and more resistant to the therapies that we have available. And unfortunately, with this spread of antimicrobial resistance and increasing infectious disease threats that are unable to be treated by the products we have, at the same time, we're seeing a dwindling of the antibiotic pipeline. There are not enough products in development today to treat the infectious disease threats that are here today, let alone what may come down the pike. We know that according to a recent BIO analysis, there are fewer than 50 innovative programs in development to treat bacterial threats. That is way too small, and we desperately need a robust pipeline of varied different therapies to not only provide options as alternatives to currently available therapies, but new options as well for when the options that we have right now no longer work for patients. Unfortunately, we're seeing a crumbling of the antibiotic pipeline, as I just noted, and the lion's share of development that's really happening in this space is by small companies. According to the Pew Charitable Trust, over 90% of the R&D in novel antibiotics is being done by small companies. And 60% of those are what are considered to be pre-revenue companies, meaning they do not have any product on the market right now and are purely in that R&D stage, pushing forward an innovative candidate, usually one, to provide new options for patients. Because of the unique characteristics of antibiotic use, namely that they must be held in reserve to ensure that they're really used only when critically needed for patients, it provides a market case and market dynamics that are not traditional and that are challenging for these innovators to remain viable and to provide a return that makes them able to continue innovating and continue bringing other products to market as well. These unique challenges of the antimicrobial marketplace are something that a whole host of antimicrobial stakeholders are hoping to address through various policies. Fortunately, there are a couple of options on the table that stakeholders are working to advance, Peggy Lillis Foundation being a strong partner in this work. And again, I'll underscore that these policies that are aimed to address the unique characteristics of the antimicrobial marketplace are always tied to critical stewardship mechanisms and improvements to antimicrobial surveillance and stewardship. I'll talk specifically about two policies today that, taken together, really help provide a comprehensive solution to address these challenges in the antimicrobial ecosystem. The first of those is called the PASTEUR Act, the pioneering antimicrobial subscriptions to enable okay, I just lost the end of the acronym, but we'll follow up with you later on that. And the PASTEUR Act is a bipartisan, bicameral policy that was introduced first in the 116th Congress and then reintroduced in the 117th, that would provide a novel, delinked subscription model for critically needed antibiotics that treat the most dangerous resistant threats. By providing a new way to pay for antibiotics that is delinked from the volume that is used. This creates a viable return on investment for the innovating company, while also ensuring that they are held in reserve and really used appropriately. There's also a particular provision in the PASTEUR Act that would provide $500 million to help support antimicrobial stewardship programs in hospitals, with an eye to under-resourced hospitals, critical access hospitals, rural hospitals that may on their own have serious challenges on standing up the stewardship programs that are really needed to ensure antibiotics are used appropriately. The PASTEUR Act was included in 21st Century Cures 2.0, which is a healthcare policy that is advancing and under consideration in the House, and has wide bipartisan support. I think as of today, 40 co-sponsors, 20 of which have been added just since the beginning of 2022. So really gaining momentum on the PASTEUR Act, which is fabulous to see. If enacted, the PASTEUR Act would really be transformational for the antimicrobial ecosystem to support appropriate antimicrobial stewardship and surveillance measures, as well as provide an incentive for these innovators that is delinked from the amount of product used. In addition to the PASTEUR Act, there is another policy under consideration that aims to address reimbursement challenges, particularly for products, antibiotics that meet unmet medical needs, specifically those that are qualified infectious disease products that meet serious or life-threatening infections. The reimbursement reform that is under consideration in Congress is called the Disarm Act. And I'll also note that there is a way to address these reimbursement challenges for novel antibiotics through CMS directly, through annual IPPS rulemaking, which is something that AMR stakeholders also look to are also looking to move forward. The Disarm Act, or a Disarm-like reimbursement strategy directly with CMS, would de-link or show or pay separately outside of the MSDRG for qualified infectious disease products to ensure that patients are able to have these products prescribed when they are needed. This is a solution that taken together with the PASTEUR Act could help address some of these unique market considerations for antibiotics, to help bolster an innovative and robust and diverse pipeline of anti-infectives, to bring new options available to patients. I'll go ahead and stop there and pass the mic down the line to some of my fellow panelists, but looking forward to a vibrant discussion today, and answering any questions from the group when we get to that time.
All right, I think I'm up next. Well, it's a pleasure to be here again. My name is Anna Hyde with the Arthritis Foundation. I want to thank Kevin for giving me the opportunity to be here. He's been a longtime advocate with the Arthritis Foundation and former staff member as well. So I'm really kind of following in his footsteps here. I just want to spend a few minutes sort of giving some narrative around how in the sort of patient advocacy nonprofit world, we do our best to achieve successes. It's an interesting place to be, especially right now. I'll start with just kind of an overarching theme, which is around strength in numbers. So it may seem odd to have someone from the Arthritis Foundation, completely different therapeutic area than you all are here talking about today. But the issues that we deal with are probably the same that you deal with. And we all kind of have different challenges. But that sort of goes back towards, I would consider that the sort of common denominator is how important strength in numbers is for a few reasons. One is that it's not probably surprising to know that members of Congress are inundated with asks all the time. And so, if you're a member of Congress, you probably have hundreds every single week of people talking to you, bringing different issues to you, and trying to get you to, co-sponsor their legislation or whatever it may be. If we, the Arthritis Foundation, are going to the Hill and talking about, the need to reduce burdensome prior authorization, for example, we're one person doing that. However, if we're coordinating with 20 or 30 other organizations who all care about the same thing, then they're going to hear that more. So part of it is that just that consistency in messaging, but it also makes us as a community look more sophisticated because we're all using the same talking points, we're using the same messaging. I've certainly been in the situation before where the opposite is true, where you're not coordinated and a member of Congress gets very angry because, well, we just heard about this why aren't you guys working together? Why aren't you working together? So those are just some kind of lessons learned along the way. And the other thing is that because we're in nonprofit, resources are limited, and money is part of that, but really a bigger part oftentimes is time and bandwidth. I have a team of 5 to cover the dozens of priority issues that we have on any given day. That's federal and state. And so the ability to sort of link arms with our partners, particularly in the patient and provider community and consumer health groups, is really critically important because, if we're trying to gain traction on an issue, building co-sponsors, for example, on a priority piece of legislation, I don't have time to go visit 535 offices on the Hill to try to get, my story across. I need to find partners that we can sort of literally divide and conquer. And sometimes it doesn't seem glamorous, but it's so effective and important. Let's pull out our Excel spreadsheet and divide, you take numbers 1 through 10, I'll take 11 through 20, et cetera, to get the meetings, to schedule them, and to try to sort of maximize our impact. That's really vitally important. The other thing is, we all have different challenges that we have to overcome within our disease areas. So one that we deal with, Kevin alluded to before, if you walk into a room and you've never met Kevin before, you have no idea that he has psoriatic arthritis because, with the success of biologic medications coming onto the market and being available to people, it's become for many an invisible disease. And so now we have to overcome that challenge. Well, you look healthy, so why should I care about your issue? I have all of these other people and all these other things and these other diseases that aren't invisible that I'm going to put my time into. The other thing, this is an unfortunate reality, but arthritis is not a high mortality disease either. So we do not get the funding and the resources and the attention that a lot of other disease areas get. And that is absolutely reflected in the federal funding allocations that go to arthritis programs versus others. So that's another kind of barrier that we have to work against. And then we have, this gets more to the sort of access to therapy side of things. We have a lot of high cost medications. Biologic medications are very expensive to manufacture. And, arthritis drugs, if you look at the top 10 high cost drugs at any given point, like in Medicare, for example, at least 1, if not 2, or usually 3 arthritis biologic medications are going to be on that list. And so maybe you do have access. Perhaps you have access. Perhaps you have a lot of therapeutic options on the table, your ability to actually get the medication and take it and stay adherent to it is much more complicated because of utilization management techniques and other things that payers are going to do to try to keep their costs down. It's really a systemic issue, and I would say a systemic failure that we're in that position, but we are. So prior authorization, step therapy, you must try and fail on this medication before you can get the one that your doctor prescribed to you, which is particularly egregious if the health plan wants you to fail on a drug that you have already failed on. So some common sense guardrails around how to make sure that utilization management can happen. Payers can put in policies to try to manage their costs. They should be allowed to do that, but that aren't so burdensome that they cause adverse health impacts to the patient. So that is one of the sort of tides that we have to ride once you even have access. There's another issue that sort of combines, I think, a lot of areas, whether you're in the rare disease space, you're just working to get a medication onto market, or you have one on market already. And that has to do with how we assess value to a medication. And this is increasingly a hot topic. Kevin knows all too well. I've pulled him into many conversations around how to assess value. We've had to deal with that for drugs that have been on market for decades. But certainly if you're a new therapeutic area, that's something that you're going to have to sort of grapple with. Who is deciding what's valuable or how to assess value? And is the patient involved in that decision-making process? We think that the patient is woefully underrepresented and should be a much bigger part of the conversation. That's another strength in numbers kind of argument. There are a number of ways that we can link arms, and some are already very much in existence. And so we, the Arthritis Foundation, we very much believe in coalition building. Everything is done via coalition in Washington, and we are no exception. So, I mentioned step therapy. We have a state-based, this gets sort of into success stories, which is where I'm going to end. We have a state-based coalition that deals exclusively with out-of-pocket costs for medications and with step therapy, and trying to put in place guardrails. And the reason that we helped to co-create that coalition is because, we saw a need at the state level for step therapy guardrails, and we knew that we couldn't do it alone. And so we got a group of it's patient and provider groups, and in partnership also with industry to get notch some legislative victories at the state level. And we've been really successful in the 6 years that coalition has been in existence. We have now secured step therapy protections in over half the states. And we're using that model legislation that we all sort of wrote and agreed to at the federal level as well. And the legislation at the federal level, it's the third Congress, which sounds like a lot, but in the long game that is federal legislation, it's like a toddler, maybe the third Congress that this legislation has been introduced. We've got more than 200 organizations who have signed on in support of that legislation, which is really important to be able to take that letter into your meeting with your member of Congress and say, look at how many organizations support this. It's not just me. I personally think that cross-therapeutic kind of approach is really powerful and impactful. While we have not passed that legislation yet, that support building the co-sponsors, then saying, okay, we have the co-sponsors, now let's get a hearing, getting that hearing and say, okay, now we need to mark up this legislation. Let's keep kind of inching forward. Being able to put people from different therapeutic areas, and the more diverse, the better, frankly, to show the breadth of the issue is really impactful. We were able to use that approach to get step therapy passed in Minnesota is a good example, where we used our advocate leadership to help do that. And most recently, a loan repayment program to deal with the workforce issue, because we have a major pipeline issue in workforce with pediatric, in particular, subspecialties across the board. But we were able to use a cross-therapeutic approach to get a loan repayment program funded for the first time in its 12-year history just last year. So that was really amazing. I mentioned that federal is kind of a long game. I would say that about legislative advocacy, period. And there are different ways that we approach advocacy, because if you need help affording your drug that's going to potentially save your life, you can't wait for the long game. You need help today. So there are other ways that we try to empower patients to be able to just essentially advocate for themselves in any situation. And I would say the success of a good advocacy program is being able to connect a person, a patient or a provider or whoever your volunteer may be, to the right opportunity at the right time. We've seen a lot of success with social media, particularly with payer policies. The last thing payers want is to be publicly shamed. And so we've seen some really interesting success stories there. So part of what we do is try to provide training and resources and materials to help folks craft messages that are going to help them get what they need. But, to make systemic change, you really do need to be part of the long game. That may be one thing that helps you today, but what happens tomorrow and what happens to the person next to you. And so that's where, sort of sticking with it and having these sort of successes along the way. So maybe it took 12 years to get this program funded, but now it's funded. And that's really important, and it wouldn't have happened otherwise. Hopefully sub therapy won't take 12 years, but that coalition building is really important to help make sure that we're able to get that success. And then I would say, just the last thing is there are so many different ways that both individual patients and nonprofit organizations can make an impact. And some of it is high profile and some of it is not, because we know that folks have different needs, they have different abilities, and different ways that they want to be active. I can't tell you how important it is for me as a staff person of a nonprofit organization to have patient stories to go to the Hill with. So you may not feel comfortable going to the Hill or testifying before a state legislature. Those are all opportunities we love to connect people with, but you may want to be more behind the scenes. That's where we have things like story banks, online story banks, where you can share your story. It comes to me, and then I can use that in my advocacy. Those are the things that make the difference. And I've been in more situations than you can imagine where, particularly with policymakers that aren't on the legislative side, but in the administration, on the regulatory side, who are making the policies that actually impact all of us, who have such misconceptions about what patients know, what they need, what they want. There's a lot of myth busting that we do. All patients want whatever therapy they want at no cost at all times. Not true. The whole kind of, my favorite is the patients just need to have skin in the game, as if you chose to have the disease that you have, as if you don't already have a lot of skin in the game by navigating the insurance system, by paying, even if you have reasonable copays and premiums and things like that. In the aggregate, you're probably still spending a lot of money on your healthcare over time. So a lot of myth busting happens, and for not being in the room and being able to deliver specific patient stories, we would be a lot further behind than we are. So that would be sort of my appeal is if you are a patient sitting in the room and you are not already an advocate or a member of your respective patient advocacy organization, join them, because it's not just being a member of a coalition who, we're as staff sort of creating some strategy and deciding who and what and when we're going to go to the Hill on an issue. We're coupling that always with action alerts, opportunities to engage as a staff person. The strength in numbers doesn't just come from the advocacy organizations. It also comes by saying, okay, we're going to hit the Hill this week on this particular bill that's important to all of us. We're also going to do action alerts and try to get hundreds of thousands of patients slamming their members of Congress as well with this request. And that's going to make it impossible to ignore. So stay engaged and stay tenacious, because the long game matters a lot. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Hi, MaryannWebb. I am a C. diff survivor, and what you just touched on about advocacy really hits home for me, because raised in an Irish Catholic family, we were taught to never really talk about our ailments, for example. It was a sign of weakness, and nobody wanted to hear about it. And so it was something you just carried quietly and carry on, right? So when I came down with C. diff, I was faced with a lot of that internal conflict in my family. But of course, when you have C. diff, and anyone in the room who is a survivor knows, you're immediately not able to do anything for yourself. You can't advocate for yourself. You need to have somebody to advocate for you. I didn't have that. And so I believe that my 3-year journey was a direct effect of the fact that I had no one to advocate for me. And that includes the doctors. that served me, they were also divided, because in the healthcare system, you're exposed to a gastroenterologist who only handles X, a hospitalist who handles Y, someone else who might handle pain, someone, I don't think they ever talk to each other, an infectious disease specialist. And, and so you're sort of at the mercy of, at your lowest point in your life. Nobody explains to you what happens when you have C. diff. Nobody explains. I think they think they're protecting you, from like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in fact, they're not giving you the information that you need. Were you able to advocate for yourself? They do not tell you that you're most likely to have this recur. They gave me the standard treatment after I had 4 or 5 failing tests before it came back positive. So that was 4 months I lost. And then they gave me Flagyl and vancomycin, and that stopped some of the worst symptoms. They're the least expensive in terms of insurance payments. And then they send you on your way out of the hospital. They don't explain what happens to you when you get C. diff. They don't explain that this bacteria sends out toxins into your body. They don't explain to you that the reason that you can't understand things is because you have C. diff. They treat it simply as a enterology infection, and you do have brain fog. I knew that I was unable to. If you gave me 4 numbers, I would not be able to repeat them back to you. But I kept that to myself because I thought that I probably had Alzheimer's disease. And so I was terrified. And when somebody asked me, don't you remember something? I would just kind of pretend and say, oh, yes, I remember. But I didn't remember. So none of this information was given to me or my family, who, they would send me out of the hospital and send me home. And they never told me that more likely than not, I was going to get it again. And I did. And so that whole time I was home, I thought, well, I must be crazy. I mean, this can't be coming back. And it did, and it did, and it did. And it was always the same treatment over and over again. Flagyl, vancomycin, send me home. So then finally, I had one doctor who said, listen, I think we should try difficile. But it's a very expensive medication. And I said, well, he said, I don't think your insurance is going to cover it. And I said, well, if I'm in the hospital, which I was, then they have to cover it. So I'll just stay in the hospital. And honestly, that was with my last breath, because normally I'm kind of a fighter. I work in a regulatory field. It's a thankless job. You're constantly having to advocate for someone or something. And I was a shadow of my former self. But with that last sort of breath, I said, well, they have to give it to me if I'm in the hospital, so I'm not leaving. And then 20 minutes later, Walgreens arrived at my bedside with difficile and a $20 copay. And I left the hospital. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the story. In the middle of this, and this is something that I really wanted to bring to everyone's attention, is there are downstream ripple effects to all of this disease. So it's not just C. diff. But for example, while I was in the throes of C. diff and having endless colonoscopies and endless PICC lines and feeding tubes, etc., my primary doctor asked me, had I gotten my annual mammogram, and I just looked at him and said, are you crazy? And he said, just do it. And I said, I don't care. And he said, why? And I said, because I know they're going to find something, and I don't have I have no more fight. So he said, just do it. And I did. And they did find something. And in the middle of all of this, I had to have a double mastectomy with reconstruction. And so then that continued. I continued to get more and more ill. I had no other options. And I began to get my affairs in order because I knew that I could feel myself at times, like I could literally feel myself dying. And one last attempt I made was to contact a doctor in Boca Raton, Florida, who, this was at the suggestion of my sister-in-law because, again, I couldn't think. And I said, maybe this FMT would work for me. I had been told by an infectious disease doctor that I didn't qualify. So when I went to see him, he took one look at me and he said, I will schedule it next week. He didn't need to see the 30,000 pages of hospital records. He didn't need to talk to my insurance company. I had a choice of 30 tablets or capsules to take, but since I vomited all the time, that wasn't an option. So at that point, I then had to deal with the office staff. And the office staff said, I'm sorry, but your insurance doesn't cover this. And I said, well, okay, I'll have to look into it, but I'm now like broke. So I had to contact my insurance company. And the one thing I was able to do was read, because luckily that's what I was schooled in. And I took the policy and I read through hundreds of pages of it. And I found that if I had failed X number of Vanco and Flagyl attempts, then and only then would they pay for the FMT. So I gave them the office the codes. I provided them with the actual document from this was Blue Cross Blue Shield, and the office said, no, your insurance doesn't cover it. So now I'm almost dead, and I said, no, it does. It says it right there, nicely. Can you read? It's right there. And they said, no, you have to pay us. And it was like $8,000 or something. So I said, okay. I talked to my insurance company, and the insurance company said, oh, yes, we definitely cover it. So I said, can you do me a favor and read me the notes of your conversation with the office staff? And they said, patient does not understand. Which is when I crawled out of my house into an Uber and drove, literally went right to my primary care's office. And I summoned all of my energy looking something like Skeletor. And I said, patient understands everything. I need you to help me. 5 minutes later, my FMT was scheduled. Then I did the FMT prep work, which is really awful for someone who has C. diff. And I went to the hospital for the day of, and I never allowed myself to think that it wasn't going to work. It was my only remaining option. And I went there and they said, you need to pay $8,000. And I said, no, my insurance is covering it. I have a letter. No, you have to pay. This continues to go on. This is the fight that that we all need advocates, because again, I'm by myself. And I'm sitting in front of an administrator and I said, trust me, I know. And there are all these teams of doctors upstairs waiting for me. And they said, well, we'll have to wait until Central Time when Blue Cross Blue Shield opens up. And she said, or we'll reschedule. And I said, you don't understand. Again, I said, I'm not leaving the hospital. I said, if this doesn't happen today, I'm dead. And she just started to cry. And that's when I knew, she said, you could be my mother. And I said, yes, I could be your mother. And she got the doctor on the phone and he said he'd be back at noon. And they got the letter from the insurance company. And then they wanted me to sit in the lobby. And I said, you don't understand. I'm not going to make it. So they found a bed and I had the procedure. And 8 hours later, 8 hours, thanks for that. I get to hear myself. It's bad enough It's bad enough that you all have to hear me. But I just want to tell you that 8 hours after the procedure, it was completely gone. I was completely healed. And it's nothing that anyone ever wants to talk about. Nobody says like, ooh, let me sign up for an FMT. I mean, it's totally disgusting. But that's how bad it is, that's what you will do to live. And, I was very aware of what this was doing to my then high school aged daughter, to watch her mother suffer like that, for my husband who had to work 24/7 just to be able to support us. And none of them really knew what I was going through. But having taken care of both parents when they had cancer, I often feel that it's the caretakers that maybe have the heaviest burden in situations like that, and not necessarily the patient. As bad as it is, I know it's much harder to watch somebody you love be sick. Don't cry. And so maybe one of the great things for us that came out of all of this is, well, I thought to myself, why did I survive? Why me? And then I realized it's probably because I have a very big mouth. I have to do something with it. And I was teetering on the edge. That's when I found Peggy Lillis. It was after the fact. And I was teetering on the edge because I knew intellectually that I needed to do something, but I wasn't strong enough yet. And I spoke with Christian, and he said, you can do this. And I was like, I don't know. And I was having like all this PTSD, and he said, there's help for that. And I was like, oh, really? And anyway, I realized that's, it gave my life, at that time in my life, and to this day, I believe it's my purpose, is to make sure that other people don't suffer the way that we suffered. And, someone has to survive and carry the torch, then let it be me, and let it be everyone in this room. And let Lauren take the example of what she experienced and put it into her work going forward in life, so that no one has to endure a preventable, unsurvivable disease that we're all working towards. So, I know I was supposed to talk about the impact of insurance. I think I kind of covered that. I was sort of forced into a lot of ridiculous therapies before finally getting the help that I need. But they're, God, if they had had something better than FMT, it surely would have been preferable. So if anyone has any questions, thank you for your time.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you guys all very much. Are there any questions for the panel?
Thank you. So it's not a question. It's just a thank you, Maryann, for sharing that. Really. I am a C. diff patient survivor. I'm also here because I'm going to write an article about all of this and my experience. I work for AARP, and I'm working with the health team to write an article about this, because I also experienced the same thing you did, but in a much shorter time period. I didn't suffer as much as you did, but the brain fog, the not being told what I had, what's going to happen, how it's going to come back. Went through vancomycin, difficile. The thing that probably, and I'm still on vancomycin, so I went back to vancomycin. I was probably safe, but I was able to get a infusion, microcope. It starts with a Z. Does anybody know? What? Yes. But a fight to get that. And I saw the bill if insurance wasn't going to cover it. And just like what you said, you need an advocate. And after I survived, I just started emailing my friends and said, this is what happened to me. And my mother is an RN, and this was all during COVID, Omicron, so she couldn't even be in the hospital with me. And it did, it was like, this is what it does feel like, dying. I
Yeah.
just lay there, and it
It
took
is.
about 4 or 5 days before I could advocate for myself, but not everybody can do that. And that's
No.
terrifying.
No, it is. And
Yeah.
there's one more thing that I wanted to mention. I've never talked about this publicly before, but it's one of those downstream unintended consequences of perhaps some of the medications, certainly of the malnutrition over 3 years. But it's a cost, right? It's a cost that I personally had to bear because insurance doesn't cover it. But I had to have all of my teeth removed because of what C. diff did to my body and the malnutrition, and have implants put in. And that was a $50,000 endeavor. So it's just not a gastrointestinal problem. It has downstream effects. I mentioned, delayed mammogram problem. Other issues, having that brain. I mean, the brain fog does go away, by the way. Yeah. It does. So there's hope, but everybody talks about, the long haul or COVID, and nobody really ever tells you about C. diff and what happens to you. So anyway, good luck to you.
Hi, I just wanted to thank all the panelists, because I think a lot of the important things that were brought up had to do with the comorbidities and the importance of not just focusing on one disease, but the fact that one disease nobody suffers from one health issue, that every health issue that we have is never isolated, that I was diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis as a kid, and that led to a TMJ problem, that led to dental issues, that led to overuse of antibiotics, that led to the destruction of my gut microbiome, that led, so it's this systemic problem that you were saying. We can't treat these things in silos. We have to all band together, because in order for us to look at this, it has to be through a holistic way. Otherwise, for us to go and try and fix a problem piecemeal, we're going to get very slim results. It's like saying, seatbelts will save lives. Well, you can make a policy, but if there's no one to enforce it, or there's no literacy and there's no campaign, then it's not going to save everyone. So if you don't work with the car companies and the policymakers and governance, then all you have is, a new gadget in a car. So the reason that I bring it up is because, much like you, I grew up in a house where, you're going to milk this one still, you're still milking this C. diff thing, and don't air your dirty laundry, no pun intended. But we didn't talk about these things because it was like, no one wants to see a picture of your baby and no one wants to hear about your medical problems. That's the way I grew up. I grew up in a Jewish house. It was like, shut your mouth, you're Yenta and whatever. So the reason that I am so appreciative of what you shared, all of you, but when you were talking about the black box label before, it made me think about what we can do to kind of help a little bit. And one of the things that comes to my mind is what we're doing in terms of the opioid crisis. Like, how many people have to die of C. diff before we start to hold some of the providers accountable and look at who's prescribing and start to flag them? And maybe that's something that we could consider, because my pain management doctor, every time he writes a prescription, somebody's watching. So maybe every time they write a prescription for an antibiotic, they need to justify, what is this for? Why are you writing it? Because they're just floating around. And that's just my 2 pennies, not that anyone asked for it. Anyway, so again, I also take biologics, and they come with their own set of risks, because now we have a bunch of immunocompromised people walking around at risk for catching bacterial infections. I've had fungal infections, I've had viral infections, and a lot of people don't understand. There's a health literacy issue with understanding the difference between a viral, a fungal, or a bacterial infection, a UTI, and how these have long-term consequences, whether it's dementia, or Alzheimer's, or heart, the semantics of step therapy versus conservative treatment, whatever you want to call it. Insurance companies need to step up. I shouldn't have to go through AbbVie to get my Humira. These things are becoming so cumbersome that people are not taking care of themselves because the effort to do so is a full-time job. So we can't work because our full-time job is taking care of our medical needs. So I'm sorry for ranting. You guys are all so amazing. And I'm going to pass the torch.
This guy, I'd like the microphone. I like the microphone, and you were using it. Thanks, Maryann, for your story, and I had the opportunity to meet your daughter earlier, so now I can see where she gets her poise and grace from. Having been on many calls with Christians, so you need that, right? But this question is more for Anna. I really did enjoy your talk, and there's at least a handful of companies in the room that are trying to develop new technologies in the CDI space. And I really did appreciate your comments about value and talking about the value. And, in terms of at least for arthritis, it doesn't have a huge mortality. And people like Kevin look very healthy. And there's a lot of patients here that look quite healthy, yet they've suffered and they continue to suffer. So maybe one question I would have is, how do you convince payers of the value of novel therapies without having patients who are sick or their caregivers are sick to have to advocate for a therapy they deserve?
Oh, that's such a big question, and one that we grapple with a lot, and are trying to work towards. I on one hand, something that I talk about a lot is, and this is an evolving argument, that because of what you just heard, that whole story, and other stories like it, there are so many downwind impacts. If you don't get access to the therapy that you need today, it's going to result in other needed medications that wouldn't otherwise have been needed, hospitalization, surgeries, you name it. That costs all of us. It costs the payer, and oftentimes what you hear from a payer is they're looking at a 1 to 2 year budget window, and that's somebody else's problem, or that's next year's problem, or whatever it is. The argument that I'm trying to make is, and build an evidence base around, which is where the patient stories come in and are so important, is yes, however, you will inherit somebody else's problem as well. It's cyclical. 2 years, this person may be passed off to another payer, but that other payer is passing somebody off just like that person to you. So it's really within our best interest, cumulatively and collectively, to make sure that patients can get the therapy that they need when they need it and live as healthy lives as they can. The trick is that there are obviously intense market perverse incentives at play. So to make that argument in a way that doesn't sound overly Pollyanna, but is undergirded by data and, rationale that's going to speak to that person, I think it's a lot of it has to be tailored messaging that sort of meets any given stakeholder where they are. But the advocacy, not just with the legislator and the regulator, but with the payer directly, with the employers who are increasingly trying to take more control over their bottom lines when it comes to healthcare costs, and others. That's something that we're actively engaged in at the moment, and hope to build a lot of partnerships around. Kevin knows all about this. He's been involved. In case you didn't pick up on this, he's on our National Advocacy Committee, so he stays incredibly involved with all of the work that we do. So that's not a direct answer to your question, because I don't entirely know what the answer is, but something that we're trying to get at and work more directly with payers to help them kind of understand that the patient does understand.
But I think I just add to that too. I mean, I think that these patient stories are so important. I mean, as a kid with arthritis, I was not about to tell anybody that I had arthritis. I mean, it was an old person's disease. I was trying to meet girls. The last thing I wanted to do is be like, I've got my AARP card. Would you like to go out for a date? And I know with C. diff, it's the same challenge, right? I tried my best. But it's really important. I mean, nobody's going to tell our story except us. And, the story that you mentioned about you losing your teeth. I mean, I doubt that's going to be something that's in a a peer-reviewed journal article, but it is something that will stick in the mind of a legislator well beyond, the 20, 30 minutes that you spend with them. And again, it's vitally important because you're not just speaking for yourself, but all the other folks out there that may not have found their voice yet. And I just think that that's what's going to change policy.
I really didn't know that telling our stories was as powerful as you were all telling us that it is. And that's why I continue to do it. It was, against every cell in my being to do so.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's what moves the needle, we'll do it.
One and two.
I have a question from our live stream from Susan O'Brien. She says, "Thank you, Maryann, for sharing and for your strength. Truly inspirational." She wants to know how you went about recovering emotionally, if you felt comfortable sharing.
That was a mess. I didn't realize that what I had actually, Christian can take a lot of credit for it because he said, there's help for that. I didn't realize what was happening is that I had PTSD from a lot of things, because no one really knows about C. diff. Even in my own family, I was accused of being a drug addict because of the way I looked. So, when it was all resolved, I replayed over and over and over in my head all of the things, all of the ways that I had been mistreated in the healthcare system and the things that I had to go through, and they are nightmarish. And then I went to a counselor at Lauren's suggestion. It's so nice when your children are smarter than you are. And I went to a counselor and she said, "You definitely have PTSD and you need to go to a physician and try this medication, Lexapro." I also did guided meditation, and both of those worked perfectly for me. The Lexapro stopped the ruminating thoughts and remembering. It worked so well that I would try to remember something horrible that I had been ruminating about just to see if the medication was working, and it stops those thoughts. At least that's what worked for me. And then also doing the guided meditation and eventually time, because you start to realize it's not coming back. Another thing is that we call it the 3-day rule, those of us in this great club. If you start to have symptoms and you start freaking out thinking that it's coming back, give it 3 days. And in 3 days, it's normally nothing to do with C. diff and it resolves. And you just don't go down that rabbit hole. So that's how I deal with it.
It's amazing how Irish Catholicism has ruined us, but also made us very sturdy. So we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to move into our breakout sessions. Do we have one?
Thank you so much for your story. I'm Debbie Goff. I'm an infectious disease pharmacist that works at Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. And I just want to assure you that there are healthcare providers that do listen. At our medical center, which is a very large facility, we have specialized pharmacists and pharmacy technicians that are patient advocates. And so we do recognize the barriers for our patients in acquiring expensive medication, and their job, they do that for you. So we determine you need this expensive $1,000 therapy, whatever it is, and we will fight that insurance company. That is their full-time job, is getting that. So when you're discharged, you don't have the burden to go through that. That system doesn't exist in all hospitals, but I wanted to tell you there are some, and we're one of them. So we hear you.
Well, Wexner at Ohio State. So thank you guys so much. We're gonna have to leave it there. I keep saying that like I'm a cable news host. We're gonna have to leave it there without solving the problem. But we're gonna continue. So thank you so much to Emily, Maryann, Anna, and Kevin for moderating.